All right, so today we're going to be tackling a topic that has sparked a lot of debate over the years, a lot of disbelief even. Female ejaculation. And to get to the bottom of this, we've got a pretty big stack of research articles, cultural observations, firsthand accounts, all that good stuff. But the mission here is to give you, the listener, a clear picture of what we know and what we don't know about female ejaculation.
Yeah, what's really fascinating is that even with all the information that's out there, there's still so much confusion about this topic. So maybe we should start by getting clear on exactly what we're talking about.
Exactly. We're not talking about just like regular lubrication. And really importantly, we're not talking about, those oops moments, urinary incontinence. So we're defining female ejaculation specifically as that expulsion of fluid during orgasm. But the real question is this like a totally separate bodily process, or is it something else entirely?
Yeah, that really is the million-dollar question, and it's
Yeah.
one that has definitely sparked some pretty heated debates over the years.
Definitely. One of the sources that we're looking at today, female ejaculation and the G-spot. It mentions that a surprising number of women actually report this experience. But the range is kind of wild depending on the study. It goes anywhere from like 10% up to 69%. That's a huge gap.
Yeah, and that range in itself, I think, just highlights one of the biggest challenges in this whole area, just defining exactly what we mean by female ejaculation. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of phenomenon. So studying it and understanding it just becomes so much more complex.
Well, I think the first question on everyone's mind is this fluid just urine?
Yeah, it's a natural assumption, but the research has actually shown that the fluid is chemically different. For instance, there was a study done by Zaviachik and colleagues, and they found that there were much higher levels of fructose, which is a type of sugar, and something called prostatic-specific antigen, or PSA, in the ejaculate compared to urine.
Hold on, PSA. Isn't that something that's found in men? That I'm really intrigued.
That's right. And as you might guess, that finding has some pretty interesting implications. But I think before we get to that, it's important to understand that for a long time, female ejaculation wasn't even acknowledged as a real possibility.
Yeah, I mean, even like Masters and Johnson, those like giants of sex research. Initially they just dismissed it as accidental urination. Can you believe that?
It just goes to show you how powerful cultural biases can be, even in science. If you think about the context, 19th and early 20th century, female sexual pleasure was just such a taboo topic, rarely discussed openly, let alone actually studied rigorously.
It's mind-boggling to think about it now, especially in 2025. But I guess those historical attitudes have really cast a long shadow, haven't they?
Absolutely. And it's worth pointing out that even some feminist writers, like Sheila Jeffreys, she actually viewed female ejaculation as a male fantasy, a way to further control women's sexuality. So you see how this topic starts to get really complex. You've got biology, societal norms, feminist perspectives, all kind of intertwined.
It's a tangled web, but a fascinating one for sure. Okay, before we get too deep into the cultural side of things, let's maybe zoom in on the anatomy a little bit. So I know our listeners probably wondering, what role, if any, does the infamous G-spot play in all of this?
It definitely seems to be connected. The G-spot, or to be more precise, the Skene's glands, are this cluster of tissue that's located on the front wall of the vagina, near the urethra. And get this.
Right, you got my attention.
Some researchers actually propose that these Skene's glands are homologous to the male prostate gland.
Whoa, that's a serious connection. Wait, does that tie back into the PSA thing we were talking about earlier?
Exactly. The shared embryological origins and the presence of PSA and female ejaculate, it really suggests this deep evolutionary link. It's like all these hidden parallels are starting to reveal themselves.
Now I'm really starting to see why this topic generates so much debate. But I'm also getting a sense that, this is way more than just a simple bodily function. Like, there are layers upon layers here.
Yeah, that's the beauty of it. And speaking of uncovering layers, one of the sources recounts this fascinating anecdote about Beverly Whipple, who was a key researcher in this whole area.
Oh, okay, I do love a good anecdote. Lay it on me.
So she actually stumbled upon female ejaculation while she was studying urinary incontinence. Imagine that.
That's incredible. It just goes to show you how intertwined these bodily functions can be. It makes me wonder, how many other groundbreaking discoveries have happened by pure chance? But I think there was also a lot of controversy surrounding her research, right?
Definitely. So Whipple co-authored this book, The G-Spot, and Other Recent Discoveries About Human Sexuality, which really brought this topic of female ejaculation into the public eye. But as you can imagine, it was met with a lot of skepticism.
Why is that? Was there something wrong with the research itself?
Well, the book, while groundbreaking, it relied heavily on anecdotal evidence, rather than large-scale scientific studies. So, it opened up the conversation for sure.
Yeah.
But it also left room for some criticism.
So it's like the book was this important stepping stone, but we needed more rigorous research to really back up those initial observations.
Precisely. And that's where things get even more interesting. Because it turns out that how we view and experience female ejaculation can differ dramatically across cultures.
All right, now we're talking. I think this is what our listener has been waiting for. Give us some examples.
For instance, the Truckee people in Micronesia, they traditionally see female orgasm as often being signaled by urination, which is a completely different perspective than what's common in Western cultures.
Wow. That really challenges our assumptions, doesn't it? It makes you realize how much our own cultural background shapes our understanding of these experiences. Do you have another example?
Absolutely. The Batora people in Uganda, they actually teach young women this technique called kachapati, which involves wait for it spraying a wall during orgasm. It's considered a skill to be mastered.
Okay, that's definitely not something you learn in a typical sex ed class.
Right. And these examples just really highlight how differently female ejaculation is perceived and experienced around the world. But they also raise this important question. If this phenomenon is rooted in biology, then how do we account for such vast cultural variations? That's what we'll delve into next.
It's fascinating how those historical biases that we were talking about, they still influence how female ejaculation is viewed even today. Like in some cultures it's celebrated, in others it's totally shrouded in secrecy and shame.
Yeah, it really makes you think about how much our upbringing, our cultural background, all that stuff really shapes how we understand these experiences. So if we acknowledge that there are these cultural differences, how do we explain them? Is it all learned behavior? Or could there be a biological component at play as well? Well, that's where that whole nature versus nurture debate comes in. And as you might guess, it's not a simple answer. Some researchers believe that, the capacity for female ejaculation is present in all women, but that, cultural conditioning or psychological inhibitions, or even lack of specific stimulation techniques might prevent some women from actually experiencing it.
So it's like the potential's there, but it needs the right circumstances to be unlocked.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And that leads us back to the G-spot. If stimulating that area is really key to triggering ejaculation, then it makes sense that women who are more aware of their own anatomy and who have partners who are skilled in, G-spot stimulation might be more likely to experience it.
Okay, so that makes sense from an anatomical perspective. But wouldn't we expect to see a higher prevalence of female ejaculation in cultures that are just generally more open about sexuality?
You'd think so, right? But the data is anything but clear-cut. Some anthropologists have suggested that even in sexually permissive societies, certain taboos or beliefs about bodily fluids, specifically female bodily fluids, they might still discourage women from exploring or even acknowledging this aspect of their sexuality.
It's almost like there are these layers of cultural programming
Yeah.
that can override our natural instincts. I mean, think about how even in the West, which likes to think of itself as so progressive, there's still so much silence and shame surrounding female sexuality in general.
It's true. And that lack of, open and honest conversation can make it incredibly difficult for women to really understand and accept their own experiences.
Yeah.
Imagine experiencing something as intense as female ejaculation, but having no positive framework for making sense of it.
Oh, I can totally see how that would lead to a lot of confusion and self-doubt. I mean, it makes you wonder how many women have experienced it, but just dismissed it as something wrong or weird simply because they had no point of reference.
Exactly. And that's why I think having these conversations is so important. Bringing this topic out into the open allows us to challenge those outdated norms and create space for a more accurate and empowering understanding of female sexuality.
Knowledge is power, right? The more we learn about our bodies and the full spectrum of human sexual experience, the more we can dismantle those harmful stigmas and just embrace our own pleasure without shame or guilt.
Couldn't agree more. But reclaiming that power requires understanding, and that's where the research comes in. Despite all the controversy and limitations that we talked about earlier, there have been some fascinating studies that are really starting to shed light on the physiological mechanisms of female ejaculation.
Okay, back to the science. I'm ready for another aha moment. So what have researchers discovered about the actual composition of the fluid?
Well, this is where things get a little more complex. It turns out there's not just one type of fluid that can be expelled during female orgasm. So we already talked about the fluid that's produced by the Skene's glands. which is rich in PSA and fructose.
Right, the prostate connection. That was a mind blower for me.
But there's also evidence suggesting that some women expel fluid from the Bartholin's glands, which are located near the vaginal opening. And this fluid tends to be clear and slippery, more like what we typically think of as vaginal lubrication.
So it's possible that what some women are experiencing as ejaculation is actually just like a heightened form of lubrication.
Exactly. And to add another layer of complexity, some researchers believe that in certain cases, a small amount of urine might also be expelled during orgasm.
Wait, hold on. I thought we established earlier that the fluid wasn't urine. Are we backtracking here?
Well, it's not quite that simple. While the fluid from the Skene's glands is definitely distinct from urine, the intense muscular contractions that happen during orgasm, they can actually put pressure on the bladder and potentially lead to the expulsion of a tiny amount of urine, along with other fluids.
Ugh, this is why this whole topic is so tricky. There are so many variables at play. It seems almost impossible to isolate these different fluids during such an intense experience.
Yeah, you're hitting on a major challenge in this field. It's ethically and logistically very difficult to study these processes in a way that provides definitive answers. And that's a big part of why there's still so much debate and uncertainty surrounding female ejaculation.
So where does that leave us? It sounds like even the experts are still trying to piece together the puzzle.
That's right. But that doesn't mean we should just throw up our hands and give up.
Yeah.
There are researchers out there pushing the boundaries, developing new techniques for studying female ejaculation in a more nuanced and comprehensive way.
That's encouraging. So what's next for this field? Where do you see the research heading?
Well, I think one of the most exciting areas of research is exploring the individual variability we've been talking about. Why do some women ejaculate copiously, while others produce only a few drops or none at all? What factors, anatomical, hormonal, psychological, might account for these differences?
It's like each woman's experience is a unique puzzle waiting to be solved.
Exactly. And that's what makes this research so fascinating.
Yeah.
It reminds us that there's still so much to learn about the intricacies of female sexual response. But I think our listeners are probably eager to move beyond the theoretical here.
You're reading my mind. Let's get practical. If experiencing female ejaculation is something that can be learned or enhanced, where do we even begin? Okay, so let's get down to the nitty-gritty. If experiencing female ejaculation is something that can be learned or enhanced, what are the first steps?
Well, as we've touched on, I think throughout this whole deep dive, stimulating the G-spot seems to be key for a lot of women.
So G-spot stimulation 101, where do we even start? I think maybe a little anatomy refresher would be helpful here.
Absolutely. So the G-spot, or to use the more technical term, Skene's glands, is located on the front wall of the vagina, a couple of inches inside. And it feels kind of slightly raised or spongy. Some people say it feels a bit like a walnut.
Okay, got the picture. But finding this elusive spot can't be that easy, right?
You're right, it does take some exploration. The key is to use your fingers and gently apply pressure to the front wall of the vagina. And you're feeling for that distinctive spongy texture. And it might feel a little sensitive or even trigger a slight urge to urinate.
So that feeling is totally normal. I can see why some women might get a little freaked out if they feel like they're about to pee.
Yeah, it's totally understandable. But that sensation can actually be a good sign that you're on the right track.
Okay, so let's say you've successfully located your G-spot. What's next?
Well, now the real fun begins. Once you've found the spot, experiment with different types of stimulation. Some women respond best to direct pressure, while others prefer a more gentle circular motion.
Like a come-hither swirl.
Exactly. And, don't be afraid to get creative. You can try incorporating toys like a curved G-spot vibrator.
I bet that got our listeners' attention.
Toys can definitely add a whole new dimension of sensation. But, don't underestimate the power of mental stimulation either. Erotic fantasies, visual aids, anything that enhances your arousal can make a big difference.
So it's all about finding what works for you. It's like a personal treasure hunt.
Exactly. And remember, there's no right or wrong way to experience pleasure. What works for one woman might not work for another. The key is to approach this with curiosity and a sense of adventure. And, don't get discouraged if you don't experience ejaculation right away. It might take some time to find the techniques and the mental state that works best for you.
It's like learning any new skill. Patience and practice are key.
Absolutely. And communication is crucial.
Yeah.
Especially if you have a partner, let them know what feels good, what doesn't, and encourage them to explore with you.
Teamwork makes the dream work. But before we wrap up, I think it's important to acknowledge that, there are still a lot of people out there who are skeptical about female ejaculation. Some even believe it's a complete myth. What would you say to those folks?
I'd say keep an open mind. The research is still evolving, and there's growing evidence to support the existence of this phenomenon. But even more importantly, I think, just listen to women's own experiences. If women are reporting these experiences, then they deserve to be acknowledged and explored, even if the science hasn't fully caught up yet.
It all comes back to trusting women and believing their lived experiences. Okay, as we bring this deep dive to a close, is there one key takeaway that you want our listener to remember?
I'd say embrace the mystery. Don't be afraid to explore, experiment, and challenge any assumptions that you might have about your own body. And if you do experience female ejaculation, own it. It's a natural and powerful expression of your sexuality.
And if you haven't experienced it yet, don't write it off. Keep exploring, keep communicating, and you never know what amazing discoveries you might make about yourself along the way.
Well, this has been a really insightful conversation. Thanks for having me.
The pleasure was all ours. And to our listener, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of female ejaculation. We hope you've learned something new, challenged some assumptions, and maybe even sparked a little curiosity to explore further. Until next time, keep diving deep.